Albion Historical Society and the China Historical Society. And then I don't know, where is Phil? And Phil Dow is another technical expert with both societies that may have something to say. So without further ado, thank you, Bob.
Okay, thank you. You know, there's always a comedian somewhere, you know. We're going to, you're going to have to let me know if the speaker is working or not. I can't really judge from up here if it is. Okay, we'll do something here. Hang on.
Give it a sound.
How's that? Is that any better? No better. How about now? Hey, there we go. All right. Anytime during this time here, if anybody has a problem they can't hear or whatever, just give a shout, stand up, wave, do something, because we want people to be able to hear. Well, as Scott said, I'm Bob Wallace from up to Albion, but technically I live in China on Lakeview Drive. So, and I'm a member of the China Historical Society as well as the Albion Historical Society. And really great to see all you folks out tonight. It's wonderful to have people come to listen to me drone on about the narrow gauge railroad. But just to tell you a little tiny bit about the Albion Historical Society, we were formed back in 1988. Incorporated in '88. Phil actually started it a couple of years earlier than that. But at the time in '88, when we formalized the society, some of the charter members was Phil Dow and his wife Janet, my wife Pam, and myself, and then Catherine Sawtell and her mother Helen Key, and then Ruby and Raymond Wiggin, who are famous, of course, from Albion the Narrow Gauge and Big Dreams and Little Wheels. So we were some of the first members of the Albion Historical Society, and my wife can't be here tonight. She's home with a bad leg, but Phil and his wife are here, and Catherine is there too. So you've got some of our charter members here. Our sole purpose, or not sole purpose, but one of our main purposes at that time was to save the Albion Railroad Station, which at that point was in a near state of collapse. And very shortly thereafter, I believe it was during 1988, we negotiated a deal with the owners of the station to acquire it. And then a couple of years later, my career took me away, and I left town for 20 years and left Phil to lead the charge along with Catherine, raising money to fix the station up. But they did a wonderful job over the course of 20 years saving the station up there. And if you look at the brochures that many of you picked up tonight about the railroad, you're going to see on the back page a photo of the station up there from this summer when it looks really, really fantastic. But the things came out good there. So that's a little bit about Albion Historical Society.
You need to be closer to the mic.
I do.
You can get it.
All right. We'll get her adjusted here.
If I get you, would it be better if you hold it? Would you hold it closer?
I can hold it. That'll be fine.
Hold it.
Yeah, how's that? Is that better? All right. I said I wanted to feel like a rock singer, you know, and talk into the thing. So if it works, good. If it doesn't, continue to let me know. One disclaimer I want to put out here before we start. Everything I tell you is, to the best of my knowledge, what is true about the narrow gauge. But it's really hard 100 years after the thing stopped running almost to come up with absolute facts. There's nobody left alive that can corroborate a lot of stuff. And just an example of kind of some of the stuff you face, I live on Lakeview Drive, I think I just said, in Bruce Stanley's old house. Some of you people might know Bruce. I never met him, but we consider him like a family member almost. And his wife, Elizabeth, we're well familiar with her. But I came across a picture in one of the books, it was just this week, that supposedly is Elizabeth Stanley as a young girl in 1905 at the South China Railroad Station with her family coming to China for their vacation in the summertime. And I told my wife that, and she says according to the genealogy work she did on the Stanley family, Elizabeth was born in 1907. So she probably was not a teenager in that picture in 1905. So that's some of the misinformation you get. So we're going to do the best we can, and hopefully things are relatively accurate. But first off, the narrow gauge railroads in the state of Maine are they're famous worldwide. There's a big following, particularly in Europe, where there are fans of the narrow gauge railroads. And the initial interest in the narrow gauge railroads was sparked by Leonard Moody in 1959 when he published his famous book, The Maine Two-Footers. And that launched what I call the narrow gauge craze. But a few years later, just locally, Clinton Thurlow wrote two really excellent books. And apparently he was new to Weeks Mills at the time and was fascinated with the narrow gauge and wrote a book called Weeks Mills, The Why of the Two-Footer. And it was a relatively small book. He followed it up almost immediately within a year with a bigger one called the WWNF, The Hail and Farewell, which actually was very, very well written as well. And those were excellent books. I still read them continually. Immediately after that, Ruby William came out with Albion and the Narrow Gauge, which dealt primarily with the history of Albion, but also the Albion's connection to the narrow gauge railroad. And she followed that up in 1971 with Big Dreams and Little Wheels. And for the next 15 years, I would say that those two sets of books were probably the authority on the Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington narrow gauge, until David Register came along and wrote the 2 Feet to Tidewater, which was published in 1987, actually following his death, by Bob Jones, who is a noted author who himself just recently passed away. But the publication of the 2 Feet to Tidewater raised the bar completely on the history of the WWNF. They went into extreme detail and brought up lots of new information that's really cleared up some of the questions possibly raised by the earlier books. So there's been other books after that that set off kind of a craze again, and now there's more books out there about the WWNF than you can even shake a stick at. But the original railroad fever in the state of Maine commenced in the 1850s, and shortly prior to that, the first railroad in the state was built, which was the Bangor and Piscataquis Railroad that ran all the way from Bangor to Old Town. They had a very small locomotive. Later on, when we get to the slideshow, you're going to see a picture of it. It was built in 1833 in England, and it was, back in those days, they were naming locomotives. It was named the Pioneer. But as the 1800s progressed, it was just a frenzy of railroad charters being issued. Many, many of them started in the 1850s up through the end of the 1800s. Most of these railroads never were built, but there were charters that were for railroads going to every corner of the state. In 1854, there was a charter issued for the Kennebec and Wiscasset Railroad. 51 incorporators signed that incorporation document, and the primary instigator of it was a man named Henry Ingalls from Wiscasset. The target of that railroad was to go from Wiscasset to Augusta. Only 2 people had ever lived from those incorporators to see an actual railroad built, and it was our very own narrow gauge that was the final result. By the 1870s, Henry and his board of directors, remember this is 20 years later, they've now set their sights on Quebec. They're going to go to Quebec with the railroad. About that same time, in the 1880s, in the Sheepscot Valley, railroad rumblings began there with farmers and so on wanting to be able to ship their crops somewhere. For whatever reason, they also had the idea of going to Quebec. Apparently, Quebec seemed to be the be-all and end-all at that time. So around 1890, Ingalls got acquainted with some of these guys in the Sheepscot Valley that were planning a railroad, and their plan at that point was to build a railroad from the waterfront of Wiscasset, and to get to Quebec, they were going to join up with the Canadian Pacific Railroad, which was brand new at the time. Presumably the target was to get up to Greenville, and from Greenville they would piggyback on that railroad into Quebec. At this point, there was no gauge of the railroad decided upon, and the narrow gauge concept was something that was relatively new in the state of Maine. First narrow gauge railroad was promoted and built up in up in the Phillips and Farmington area is the Sandy River Railroad. People, you still able to hear me okay out there? Speaker working? Okay. That railroad was constructed approximately 1880. So that was one of the first narrow gauges. It was a brand new concept. And somehow this railroad settled in on that they could construct on their way to Quebec, at least initially, with a 2-foot gauge, and it would be much cheaper to build than a standard gauge. They could also traverse terrain that standard gauge would have a problem on. But at this point, they're still just in the talking stage until 1893. And in 1893, George Crosby from Albion, who had made his money with the Crosby Steam Gauge Company, and at that time, almost every locomotive and probably every steam boiler in the United States was using a Crosby steam gauge and also a Crosby safety valve. So George was a rich man. He built this palatial home in Albion, which is, we've got some pictures of it up here that you can look at afterwards. So George had big ideas, and one of his ideas was he thought Albion needed a railroad. He didn't care where it went, but he wanted a railroad. And the guy's ego was that big, really was. So George says, okay, we're going to go to, I think his target originally was Togus, because he wanted to connect with something else, and the Kennebec Central Railroad, I believe, was operated in Togus. Well, about this time, he catches wind of this Wiscasset, Quebec thing, and he says, well, that would be a good thing to piggyback on. So Henry Ingalls receives literally a letter from George Crosby's attorney saying they'd like to meet. Well, Ingalls, remember, he's been trying to get a railroad going since 1854. This is 40 years later, and he's an old man now and he's had very little success. So he jumps at the chance. Here's a guy with some real money and stuff, and he wants to promote this thing. So they immediately set up a meeting between Henry Ingalls and his group and the other people looking at Wiscasset and Quebec, and they get together with George Crosby. Well, from that time on, Crosby is now, suddenly he becomes the president of the new venture. He pledges $100,000 in a stock subscription, and he just sets to work promoting this thing. And I had in my notes that it set off a whirlwind. George was a talker, he was a promoter. Town after town along the lines up to pledge money to this thing. They firmly decided on a 2-foot gauge. It's just off to the races. As far as the plan goes, there's only one plan in George's mind. This railroad has to go to Albion. He doesn't care how it gets there, but it's going to Albion. Of course, there's other people who want it to come up through Alma and Whitefield and so on. So somehow Windsor and Weeks Mills and China and so on and so forth are on that route to Albion, so they kind of piggyback on the thing too. So I think all of us that are fans of the narrow gauge in this area owe it to Crosby for the route that was selected. Their ultimate target at this point is to go to Burnham, and in Burnham they really, I don't think, have much of a plan on where they're going after that, but presumably somehow they get up to Greenville. So by 1894, they're going to have their grand kickoff of this thing, and George, of course, is the primary face of this. Now, disaster strikes, so to speak, about this time, and that is because George Crosby's stock subscription is coming due, and he literally owes them a pledge of a whole lot of money, and there's no sign of the money. So there's panic in Wiscasset. Henry Ingalls, like I said, he's an old man. He's panicking. Everybody in Wiscasset is panicking. Where is Crosby? Crosby hasn't been seen now for several weeks, apparently. So they send a delegation. This is literally, they send a delegation to Albion, to the big old Crosby mansion, and they come back with a reply that George says, and this is a quote supposedly, that he's thin in the wallet. Well, that's not a good sign. Well, if you look at the real facts of what are going on, George is no fool. This common stock that he's pledged, he's probably never going to get a dividend off it. It turns out behind the scenes, George is actually investing in the bonds, because this railroad is selling bonds as well, and I believe they're paying 7% interest. Ruby Wiggin claims that he went so far as to, and she was a family member, sort of George. She claims he went so far as to liquidate holdings in the state of Massachusetts so he could invest more and more in the railroad. Well, that doesn't go along with his reneging on his stock subscription. So the conclusion could be drawn that he was buying bonds. Well, they're still after him for his stock subscription. George comes back and says, look, I've spent $30,000 promoting this railroad, and you owe me $30,000. Well, this is never approved apparently by anybody, but he comes in with a claim. They've got a public relations disaster on their hands. So what do? They come up with a compromise. They tell George, if he goes away quietly, they will give him $30,000 worth of stock, but they don't have to pay his expenses he's incurred, which are dubious at best. So George walks away suddenly. He is now the largest stockholder of the entire railroad. He's never put in a penny of it, except apparently these expenses, he say, are owed to him. He's still got his bonds. Well, a few years later, it doesn't matter because the whole thing goes bankrupt and George loses it all anyway. And subsequently, he immediately died thereafter, so it couldn't be said that the railroad did him in. But George is now out of the picture, and things are looking better again. Spring of 1894, they break ground, I think in June, without George being present, and it's off laying track. So late that summer, their first locomotive arrives on the scene. We're going to have picture Indian River Railroad. It was an old 1883 Porter locomotive that apparently had gone off the tracks there. And my understanding is it spent the whole winter in the river. They fished it out in the spring, got it ready to ship up to Wiscasset, and they got rid of it. That's exactly what they did. They got rid of it. They did not like it. Nobody liked it. They put a nice fancy paint job on it, and when it arrived on a Maine Central flat car, it was shining like a new bottle. It's beautiful, and you're going to see a picture of it here in a little bit. But the thing was, she was, to put it mildly, probably a piece of junk. But it's what they got to start. And then later that year, in 1894, they ordered 2 brand new locomotives from the Portland Locomotive Company in Portland, Maine. These were number 2 and number 3. You'll see pictures of them as we move forward as well. These were your typical early narrow gauge locomotives. They were 18-ton machines. And as I said, they were built by the Portland Company. Now, I'm just going to delve in just a second, just not to belabor the point, but just to talk about these locomotives. Every narrow gauge had at least one of them, 2 of them, maybe 3 of them. Like I said, 2 went to WW&F. Some were up to Sandy River Railroad. Some were at the Kennebec Central. Bridgeton and Harrison, or Bridgeton and Saco River Railroad had some as well. The precursor was the Hinckley Locomotive Company in Boston. And in 1890, the Hinckley Locomotive Company, which built, I believe, 8 locomotives for the Maine narrow gauges up until that time, went out of business. And the Portland Company bought the rights to their design for the narrow gauge 18-ton locomotive. They made some improvements to it, but then they started building essentially identical machines under the Portland brand. And there was another 7 built by the Portland Company for the Maine narrow gauges. So number 2 and number 3, they arrived late in the year 1894 down to Wiscasset, and they will be used on the railroad right up until the year before the final trains ran in 1933. And the final locomotives ever used on the railroad were actually sisters to that came from other spots, most recently from the Kennebec Central Railroad, but they were identical machines. And so the railroad ended using, in essence, the same type of power that it started with in the very beginning. By February 1st of 1895, they were in Weeks Mills laying gravel. They'd come for ballast. They'd come all the way up through from Wiscasset. Station at Windsor was completed about the 1st of the year. By February 20th, train service was started. Actual regular train service was started from Wiscasset to Weeks Mills, and construction continued on up the line as they were moving up towards Albion. By September, they were to China Village. November 4th, the first train in 1895 rolled into Albion. And by the end of the year, regular train service to Albion was a reality. They stopped at that point to regroup before moving forward. In the end result, they should have just stopped for good, but they didn't. They continued on towards Burnham, and then, of course, the following plan after Burnham would be to continue on towards Pittsfield, I believe, in Greenville, eventually. But money problems were plaguing them. Remember, they never got Crosby's funds, so it may have been part of the problem. But there was basically a 2-year pause there in Albion from 1895 until 1897 when they really got going on the way to Burnham. But they graded all the way to Burnham. Presumably they used the number 1 locomotive, probably working on laying rail up through to Burnham. They laid rail, I believe, most of the way. In 1897, they got to Burnham. They ran into, they got to the Maine Central Railroad tracks there, which was actually later the Belfast and Moosehead Lake, or that's the section of rail that was controlled at the time by Maine Central. And when they got there, they petitioned the railroad commissioners for a crossing. And the local legend is that the commissioners, this is repeated by Ruby Wiggin and also first came out with Leonard Moody, was that the railroad commissioners said, yeah, sure, you can cross, but you've got to build an overhead bridge, and so on and so forth. Well, in reality, that was actually the state statute at the time regarding railroad crossings. So it was nothing that was cooked up specifically for this railroad. It was actually the way things operated. So that was granted, that they could build an overhead crossing. Well, there's arguments about that. Obviously, funds were low and so on. So they petitioned to put in a temporary diamond crossing, and Maine Central declined that. They protested it. And that actually was tied up in litigation for 2 years until 1899. In 1899, the railroad commissioners ruled in favor of Maine Central against the Wiscasset and Quebec, and that was the end of crossing the tracks. Obviously, under normal circumstances, they would have appealed that, but unfortunately, they were in no position to continue any further, and they probably saw it as a relief to their fiasco that they could just simply throw in the towel and operate the railroad they had. So after that disallowance of their crossing request, the thing basically went into receivership in 1899, and it ran for a year or two under receivership until 1901. When, of course, it's bankrupt, and by this time it's under the control of the banks and so on. But prior to that, the Farmington group kind of raises their head, and a gentleman by the name of Leonard Atwood, who actually was not associated with the Sandy River Railroad, to the best of my knowledge, he came up with a grand plan that he was going to combine and create a narrow gauge empire and link the seacoast of Wiscasset using the WW&F, or at that time the W&Q, to reach up to the forests up above Phillips and Strong and so on and so forth, build a connection called the Franklin and Somerset, I think it was, up through from passing through Waterville, moving up to Farmington and connecting with the Sandy River Railroad. So he's working that proposition. Well, we've got the courts now that are in charge of the W&Q. They need to get rid of it. It's bankrupt. So somehow a deal has worked, and the whole thing is turned over to Leonard Atwood. He presumably bought it for some degree of funds. And in 1901, he takes over the Wiscasset in Quebec, renames it the Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington Railroad. And they set off, because he's already working up on his trackage and stuff up around Farmington. They set off with branching off from the W&Q at Weeks Mills, and they're on their way to a crossing up in Waterville. Well, there's no real support for this thing coming from anywhere because the Sandy River people aren't really enthused with the idea, so they're not supporting Atwood. He's an outsider. But he starts his new venture. They leave Weeks Mills. They come up through South China, East Vassalboro, North Vassalboro, and they get all the way to Windsor by 1902. Well, when they get there, they're faced with a major problem. They've got to cross the Kennebec River. They've also got to cross Maine Central tracks. So they've got real issues. And quite frankly, this thing's not going anywhere, and it didn't. But at the same time, in 1902, they realized they need, for this construction project, they need a real locomotive with some real power. And they're still running, remember, the old number 1, number and 2 and 3, which were the relatively small Portland machines. So in 1902, they get a 24-tonner from the Porter Company, and Leonard Atwood, who's a self-appointed inventor, he actually did have several patents, he designs number 4 with what he thinks is the absolute peak of technology. It's got a steam dome inside the cab. Who knows what the reasoning for that is, presumably to provide steam heat or possibly a sauna for the crew. He also has an extended metal cab that goes back over the entire tender where the coal and the water are stored. Well, what he did is he produced a top-heavy monster with this big steel cab on it, and a crew that is sweltering in the summertime, and in the event of a derailment are trapped inside this steel body. So the crew was not in favor of his design, and that particular design did not last long. But it was a real impressive-looking machine, and you're going to see pictures of that too in a few minutes. But from 1902 on until 1905, this railroad runs with its main line to Winslow, branch line up to Albion from Weeks Mills, and they're concentrating entirely on this Winslow line. And initially, they have very good passenger traffic because it's coming out of Waterville. There's a big rolling mill in North Vassalboro, and they're actually hauling people down to that mill that provide the commuter service. And actually, things start out fairly well. They're hauling the coal for the rolling mill, presumably some of the outbound product. But still, money problems plague them. They've spent a lot of wasted money on this venture towards Farmington that went nowhere. And they're in money trouble as well. Now, during this time period, they had one rip-roaring train derailment that takes place down around Elna at Carlton Brook. And it becomes famous. We got pictures of this coming up too. It's called the Masons Wreck, because the Masons from several different communities, I think Lewiston was one, as well as Waterville and Winslow, we're all going down to Wiscasset for this big get-together, and train derailed in a spectacular derailment on Carlton Brook Trestle, and the number 4 locomotive, along with its metal cab, went in the river, and we've got some great pictures of that coming up. That's probably the highlight, or the most exciting thing that happened under the Leonard Atwood regime, because he went bankrupt immediately thereafter, and the road was sold at auction in December of 1906. Well, this was the salvation of the narrow gauge, the sale, because Carson Peck from New York City, who was a real qualified businessman, he was a Woolworth Stores executive and extremely rich individual, he saw a potential for possibly a fun project, as well as I'm sure he intended to make money. But for $93,000, he bought the railroad, lock, stock, and barrel. And he made a subtle name change. He went from Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington Railroad to Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington Railway. And several things occurred under the Peck administration. Number one, they brought sound management to the railroad, something they never had before. These weren't dreamers or whatever. These were actual business people. They brought a business plan, and they brought enough money for working capital. So Peck started out, after making inspection trips and so on, and evaluating the whole thing, presumably they had done their homework beforehand, and identified the Albion line coming up through China and so on as the most promising part of the railroad. As a matter of fact, he identified that as the only promising part. And what to concentrate on, he zeroed in on basically one big target, and that was agriculture. And included in that would be forest products. So he concentrated on hauling lumber from all the operating sawmills that were in the region, these portable mills that were everywhere, along with stationary mills as well. He also moved into the potato business, which potatoes at that time were starting to be an important crop. He concentrated on hauling potatoes. He concentrated on hauling other vegetable products. Corn canning factory moved to Albion about that time, set up expressly, probably Peck had something to do with it, but set up expressly to use the narrow gauge railroad as its transport means. Another one was in Weeks Mills, the Noyes Cannery. I believe there was one actually in China too, the B&M cannery that did work on, I believe they were on Lakeview Drive. They were a customer. Another thing we moved into was milk. They hauled a lot of milk. They arranged an agreement with the Turner Center Creamery, which had a plant in Wiscasset. They hauled milk every day for almost the rest of the life of the railroad down to Wiscasset. Any of these pictures you see, you're going to see cream cans out on every platform. So he doubled his train service going to Albion. They put in 2 round trips a day. They took the Winslow branch, cut it down, even though it was theoretically the main line, they cut it down, I believe, to 1 round trip a day. Very shortly, they cut out service going to Winslow, moved it back to North Vassalboro to the mill, concentrated simply on hauling coal into the mill and whatever outbound products they were hauling. And then following this potato craze that I talked about, Peck then built potato houses along the line. So in 1910, they built at least 4 houses that the railroad itself owned, or presumably then leased out, but right on the rail line. So they built one in Albion, there was one in China Village, there was one in Weeks Mills, and one other one, and the location of that actually escapes me at this second, but there were 4 that they built. Then there were other potato houses as well that were around the region. But by 1912, Peck is hauling 200,000 bushels of potatoes a year, along with all of his other products. Another big product that you might not think of that was hauled, and this actually has a connection to China, and you'll read about it in the little brochure that many of you picked up about the China stations. But they hauled baled hay. And at that time, hay was being put up and was needed in the cities in Boston, Philadelphia, and so on. But these were the big 200-pound bales or whatever that were made by hay presses. And many loads of hay were shipped out. We're talking several hundred cars a year. China and Albion were 2 of the primary producers of hay, where the hay was being moved. And then the rest of what they were after at that time, of course, as we said, was these canneries in Albion and Weeks Mills primarily, along with the forest products. They're also hauling coal too at this time. But yeah, once again, just touching on those potato houses, as we said, there was Albion, China, and Palermo. That was the other Peck house that I couldn't come up with. Under Peck at this time too, the shops at Wiscasset were expanded, machine shops and so on. Like I said, the milk business was going strong, and at the height of the railroad, which would have been about this time, they were operating with 45 flat cars, 55 box cars, and 5 pieces of passenger equipment. Now, I failed to mention that when Peck came along, of course, he inherited these 3 older locomotives. The first thing that, well, including plus the brand new one from Leonard Atwood that was in the brook there. So the first thing you do, obviously, when you're building a business up with high hopes and stuff, and you're improving capital, is you've got to increase your motive power. So the first thing he did is he reached out and he bought another one of these Portland locomotives that, or actually it was one of the Hinckley versions from the Bridgeton and Saco River Railroad. Added power to it and did that actually about the first month he owned the railroad. But then he placed an order with the Baldwin Locomotive Company, so he's going up to a real manufacturer at this point, not just locally here in Portland. And he bought 2 locomotives. One was a high-speed passenger or mixed train locomotive, which was their number 7, which was standard configuration locomotive. Second one was a heavy freight engine, their number 6 Baldwin locomotive, which had a separate tender and so on. So traditionally, when they settled into their operations under Peck, they were running primarily 2 trains a day, 2 round trips a day, one out of Albion in the morning that went down, second train that would have left Wiscasset in the midday and ran up through, primarily hauling freight, primarily manned by number 6. And the number 7 was hauling the other round trip a day. The other locomotives were primarily relegated to yard duty down in Wiscasset, as they were aging at the time. Number 4 would have been their backup for their freight operation. Of course, in the wintertime, they were all placed into service. So under Peck, they eliminated the Winslow branch entirely and settled in entirely on that Albion line by about 1915. And one of the last gasps of breath on the Winslow branch was actually in South China, where they had a potato house that was owned by the Farmers Union. And Farmers Union, they had a contract with which they refused to give up. So they had quite a controversy with Farmers Union trying to get out of that contract so they could finally shut down the entire branch operation. They finally did arrive at an agreement where the railroad then bought the potato house in South China. And I have yet to ever find a photograph of that potato house. After they did that, they arranged for the potatoes that were originally going there to go to Weeks Mills to a Farmers Union potato house that was located there. Shortly after 1915, Carson Peck unfortunately died young, I believe, of a heart attack. His wife ran the railroad using her management team for another 10 years until 1925. And in 1925, by that time, the automobile and trucking is coming along. Passenger traffic is pretty well gone because people are traveling by automobile. And the fortunes of the railroad clearly are slipping. So Mrs. Peck decides she's going to put the railroad up for sale or she's going to shut it down, one of the two, which is probably a threat. Well, of course, along the line, nobody wanted the railroad to go away. So the farmers all banded together, and other people, but it's normally referred to as the farmers. And for $50,000, they bought the Peck's shares, presumably to make their fortune. Well, that was not to be the case, as by 1930, they're running at a loss. And basically, these folks are desperate as to what to do. So along comes Frank Winter from Auburn, who owns a large stand of timber in Palermo, and he's using the railroad for transport. So he goes around quietly during 1930 and buys up shares of stock from these farmers, or they gave him his stock, whatever. And by 1930, end of 1930, he takes control of the railroad. Well, he cuts expenses to the bone and continues on his way, and actually possibly makes a little bit of money, but at the expense of the railroad infrastructure. Late in 1931, they have an engine house fire that occurs down to Wiscasset. Unfortunately, at that time, engine number 7 and number 6 were both parked away for repairs, which Winters didn't have the money to spend on. So they were both in the engine house, were destroyed in the fire. So he's back at this point. He's running his railroad now simply with the old number 2, number 3, and the number 4, the number 4, the Porter engine that had the extended cab on it at one time. So there's 3 locomotives. None are in good shape. They're all old. And basically, throughout 1932, if you study the records, they literally were down to 1 round trip a day up to Albion. But they looked at the locomotives each day, and whatever one was in the best shape seemed to be the one that they took. And if you look at some of the schedules and stuff, you'll see that they ran maybe number 2 for a couple of weeks here and there, and then it was out of service, in for repairs. 3 took over, number 4 took over. They just rotated back and forth. So towards the end of 1932, 4 was being run almost exclusively at the end of the year. Well, the boiler inspector comes along the end of 1932, and he takes a look at the locomotives, and he cans all the power, won't extend the boiler certificates beyond the first of the year. So it looks like Winter was practically out of business before he gets started. In the meantime, he has actually personally bought the railroad. He owned the controlling share before, but he bought it out of receivership, so he owns it lock, stock, and barrel. So he needs additional power. So he goes to the Kennebec Central Railroad, which has gone defunct a few years before. There's been 2 locomotives there. Kennebec Central's number 3 and number 4, which were once again these same Portland machines that are identical to his 2 and 3. and he buys the entire railroad for the purpose of getting the 2 locomotives. He brings them to Wiscasset, and in January 1933, they arrive on scene. Number 9's in better shape. They put it into service immediately. Number 8 needs considerable amount of work done to it. They put it in the shop, get working on it, give it a new paint job, among other things, but they did a lot of mechanical work, particularly in the area of brakes and so on. So number 9 runs the railroad completely early on in 1933. Come June 13th, they've developed a mechanical issue with number 9, which requires it to go in the shop. But number 8 is pulled out. For the first time in the afternoon of June 13th, it goes into service, makes the round trip up to Albion, back again on the 14th. Then on Thursday morning, June 15th, it leaves Albion for its second or third day of service. And when it gets to Whitefield, they're running a little behind schedule in the morning, due to some stops. Remember, this one trip, they're doing all the switching everywhere, just with one locomotive. They are trying to make up a little bit of time, and they're in the Whitefield region. They're headed towards the famed iron bridge that was at Whitefield, and they encounter a broken rail. Well, rail snaps, engine goes sideways. Earl Keefe, who was from Albion, was the engineer, and his buddy was Merle Glidden, who was the fireman. They see what's happening. Merle jumps. Keefe can't get out of his seat. He's stuck, so he rides the locomotive down over the bank. Got a picture of it right here. As it turns out, he's not hurt. Merle, though, was almost killed because of the flat car immediately behind the locomotive, which continues on past the locomotive, gives it a nudge, pushing it further over the bank, keeps going. When it stopped, it just barely missed hitting Merle. Probably would have killed him, but as it was, he turned out without a scratch. And the narrow gauge essentially died right there that day, right in the banks of the Sheepscot River, right there in Whitefield. Earl Keefe and Merle, they hiked out, and Everett Baker, who was the conductor, and Mr. Bonney, I forget his first name, who was the mail clerk, they had a motorized handcar that they were taking to Wiscasset that day that was on a flat car. They found it wasn't injured and it would still work. They got that on the rails, and they rode to Wiscasset along with whatever mail they could carry, and that was it. So they rode to Wiscasset, and the other guys hiked out. They rode actually on that little rail car we got right here. And a few days later, Keefe starts hauling the mail with a panel truck, and he did that for a couple of months until the railway post office contract ran out. And at that point, the narrow gauge literally died. The wreck stayed there on the side of the bank, stayed there for years. People would go out and reminisce and take pictures of it and so on and so forth, but steal parts off it. But in the end, it stayed there until World War II, when it was actually cut up for scrap metal. So that was the supposed end of the narrow gauge. And obviously all these books were written, and everybody had a great time reminiscing, and wishing that the narrow gauge was still there. Except for one guy, and that was Harry Percival from down at Alabama. I got acquainted, Phil did too, with Harry in 1988. I actually went to a meeting where Harry called the stockholders meeting of the Wiscasset and Quebec Railroad. Turns out he bought in 1985 all that was left of the narrow gauge from the Winters Company, which was the final owner. And Harry was going to rejuvenate the railroad and start an operating museum. And he discovered that the old Wiscasset and Quebec Railroad was actually never discontinued. Went out of business, but was never discontinued. So he called for anybody that held a share of stock in the railroad, one of the old shares of stock. And he said he was having a stockholders meeting. Well, at the time I was 20-something years old, and I had what I thought at the time was my great-great-grandfather's share of stock. Turned out it was actually my great-great-uncle's, but that's fine. But I went down to Harry's meeting, took my share of stock, and walked in. I was the only one to show up with my share of stock in its original envelope that was mailed out of Wiscasset from 1894. So they verified that I was real. They looked me up, and so on. And I attended Harry's stockholders meeting. So we became kind of friends. And of course, we just started the Albion Historical Society, so Harry was intrigued with my stock and my envelope, and he used to visit us so he could make copies of documents we had and so on. So we had a meeting at my dining room table way back then. Phil and his wife were there. And Harry told us how he was going to start a museum. He was going to acquire engine number 9, which, just by fate wasn't the one that went over the bank, but was actually down in Connecticut, the only surviving locomotive from the railroad. Harry says, I'm going to be able to buy that. I'm going to start a museum, operating museum. And he left, and we said to ourselves, what is this guy smoking? I mean, he's right out to lunch. But of course, the laugh was on us because Harry did start his museum, and they go just gangbusters, and they're great friends of ours down to Alma. And they've got number 9 down there fully restored, and they run trains every week, as I'm sure many of you are aware. So Harry came through in the end. And you're going to see pictures of that. I'm going to stop talking in just a second. We'll look at the old slides. But this slideshow we've got, my wife was instrumental in acquiring these slides from the Maine State Library back in 1988. And we made up a set for us, and Harry saw them, and he was so excited that he wanted a set for the museum. And so we were trying to raise money to save the station. Harry was trying to raise money to start his railroad. So Harry went around and presented these slides all over the place, and we did the same thing. And actually, I've still got the same projector we bought to show these slides on back in 1988. And all it's ever done is show these slides. But anyway, that's kind of how things all got going. So that's our story about the railroad. The one last thing I'm going to say, and you'll get your info if you read the little brochure we have about China. But China does have the distinction of being the town within its legal limits that has more narrow gauge train stations than any other place, probably in the world, but certainly in the state of Maine. But in China, there was China Village Station. There was, for a time, the South China Station. There was the station called Palermo, which is really in Branch Mills, and the Weeks Mills Station. So there's 4 stations. Each one had a vital part in the railroad. The northern end of this thing was really the feeder for the entire railroad that kept it going all these years. And so in this little brochure, I've tried to outline some of the highlights of those stations. And I'm not going to take the time to go through it because I'm sure you've heard me talk long enough. But read that, and hats off to China for its railroad history. So with that being said, I'm going to shut up. We're going to go over to the slide portion of this thing, take a look at that. So it's going to take us a couple minutes to get set up. And slides won't take as long as my talk. But after that, if you've got any questions or whatever, be happy to answer them. And also, please take a look at our displays, including our 8-foot map here that shows the actual roadbed of the railroad, and pictures of all the stations that were along the way, and so on. So anyway, so thanks for listening to me for this half-hour speech that turned into be over 45 minutes. So. So I'm not going to have my speaker, so hopefully you're going to be able to hear me. But I'll just get. You want me to yell loud? Yeah. Okay, I'll yell loud. Okay, I've got one issue here, and that is I've got my notes for these slides, and we're in the dark, so I can't read it, but I do have a nice little light here if I can find the right door. Oh, whoops. Okay, that's good now. You can kill him. There you go. Just the modern 1988 technology here. Isn't this great? So let's get ourselves focused here too. So like I said, these are all slides that we put together in 1988. And this is my absolute favorite picture of the railroad. Ruby Wiggin read her book off with this particular photograph. And this is engine number 7 that I talked about. It's leaving Wiscasset, coming off the one end of the trestle that went to their freight yard. It's approaching the shop buildings in Wiscasset. And this is the afternoon in August of 1925. So they're headed to Albion, and you can see they're taking up some empty flat cars. They've got some box cars back there, presumably the milk car back on the end. There's a railway post office car. and they've got a stationary boiler that's probably being delivered somewhere on the line to some industry somewhere. So this is just a pretty good shot of typical operations right at the end of the Peck era in the railroad. And like I said, this is my favorite picture of the railroad of all times, with engine 7. This is my second favorite engine, number 2. This is one of the original locomotives from 1894 I was talking about, one of the Portland products. And this is actually at the end of its life. This is that last summer that they were running these things in 1932. And Peck very conveniently stenciled WWF Railway on the tenders of all the locomotives he had running at that time. They did that either in 1931 or 32, so you can always tell when these pictures were actually taken if you see that. So this was the last year of operation. So this poor old unit she'd seen some rough service all those years, but she's still going strong, and that's my second favorite locomotive of the railroad. This is that first locomotive, that first railroad in Maine, the Pioneer I told you about. Built in 1833 in England, and in 1836 that railroad, the Bangor and Piscataquis, got going. This was their first locomotive. Obviously a primitive affair, but it was the first locomotive to operate in the state of Maine. And in the 1870 time frame, this is thoroughly modern power here. This is Maine Central. Well, it doesn't have a number on it. It's back when they were naming the locomotives. But that was post-Civil War. This was the type of power they were using on the Maine Central Railroad prior to the narrow gauge railroads coming along. And that's a pretty sharp picture, I thought. And then the narrow gauges come along. This is one of those first Hinckley locomotives, number 1 from the Sandy River Railroad. That locomotive was built in 1877. It was initially used in Massachusetts on a short 2-foot gauge railroad there that played out. It was repurposed when they launched the Sandy River Railroad in 1880, and it was locomotive number 1. They had another one just like it, was their number 2. Those survived until about 1910 when they were scrapped. This is considerably smaller than even the number 2 and 3 from the W and F. This was an idea of what some of the bigger power up in the Sandy River country looks like. Phillips and Rangeley was one of the subsidiary roads of what became the Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes Railroad. This was early from late 1800s, 1884, 85, experiment with the larger locomotives. And this locomotive remained actually in service after a complete rebuild until the 1930s. And about this time, our railroad, 1894, gets going. It's one of the share of stock from the W&Q that was made out to John Boynton, whoever he is. It's identical to the share of stock that I've got made out to Francis Shoring. And this one is dated October 19th, 1894. And unfortunately, it cost $100 and the owner lost his money. So this is the locomotive I told you about, number 3 from the Sandy River Railroad. It's a little porter machine that sat in the river all winter in 1893. They fished it out, gave it a fancy paint job, and this is it arriving in the summer of 1894 down to Wiscasset. They thought they really had something there. But she had definite mechanical problems, let's put it that way. But it survived until about 1905. Here's a picture of it in service, hauling a passenger car. Probably at the time, might have been before the other locomotives arrived. Might have been the only power at the time. One of the few pictures of it in passenger service. That's next to the shop building in Wiscasset, which was brand new at the time, of course. So this would have been about 1894. This is later on. This it's on a work train. Hard to tell where that is. It could be in the big cut in down around Head Tide in Alna, perhaps. I'm really not sure. But by this time, the locomotive has been relegated to probably the work train duty, and the number 2 and number 3 are handling the regular trains. But they're loading up. Looks like they're loading gravel there. This is a picture of constructing a rail line, 2-foot gauge rail line. It's probably similar to when they built the line to Burnham, probably what things looked like. This particular picture is actually from the Sandy River Railroad. They were building one of the logging branches at the time. So this is probably from early 1900s, 1902 or something like that. I'm not sure of the location, but it's one of the logging lines on the Sandy River. Well, in 1895, the railroad got up to Palermo, as we've already said, on its way to Albion. This was supposedly the first structure that was used as a train station in Palermo, or Branch Mills, before the construction of the permanent station. And supposedly this was a big improvement over wherever the station agent was working prior to that. But it looks pretty rudimentary to me. But it's a famous picture of Branch Mills or Palermo. And this is in the late 1890s. This is probably after they've given up hopes of going to Burnham, or about that time. This is actually either locomotive number 2 or 3. And this is at Wiscasset on the trestle that went over to the freight yards. And this is actually a pretty impressive train. They've got 7 loads, it looks like there, of wood products, 5 loads of pulp, and 2 of sawn lumber. There's a boxcar on behind, and in the original photo there's a passenger coach behind that. That's absolutely as much tonnage as that locomotive could possibly handle. She's had to have been completely loaded to capacity. But that's an early picture of, like I said, either 2 or 3 in service, presumably around 1895 or so. Probably about the same time period. This is the big cut. Could be the same one where that picture was taken of the number 1. But this is coming up through Head Tide, actually in Alna. That's the church that still is on the hill down to Alna. But that shows the amount that was all cut to go through that big bank and so on. So they moved a lot of material, all with rudimentary equipment back in those days. But this picture was probably taken prior to 1900. Another picture early on. This is coming into Head Tide, and I've learned that apparently there must have been a lot of photography occurring around Head Tide back in these old days. Because I've learned any one of these pictures, if you don't know where it is, and the WWF guys will back me up on this, they said just say it's Head Tide and you're safe. This literally is a picture of a train about 1900 coming into Head Tide. Once again, this is number 2 and number 3, I would say. From looking at it, doesn't appear to be number 4. And that's got one of the old oil headlights on it at that time. But obviously, long before there's no automobiles in sight, it's definitely horse and buggy day. But this is supposedly southbound at Head Tide. Another picture, this is one of the ones that is a mystery, with a little bit of controversy to it. Once again, this is engine number 2. This is probably about 1912. Various reasons I think that. Number 1, the Turner Center Dairy and Association boxcars. This is after they were hauling milk and had cars labeled specifically for the creamery. For the headlight, they're no longer running the oil headlight. They're using actually what's called an arc headlight. So we've put this a little later than these earlier pictures. This is probably around 1912. It's before the cab was reconstructed in its final configuration, which also dates it as about that time. Controversy around this picture is, and I've learned my lesson about making assumptions. The book that, one of the books that shows this says that this is the only known picture of the flag stop station in South China, which was a mile up the lake beyond the South China station. I don't know if this is that or not. To the best of my knowledge, I don't know that they hauled milk on the Winslow line. Could have been. Seems doubtful to me that's where that really is, but the book says that. It could be. Now, I've always said that was down on Maxey's Crossing myself, but whatever. It's one of these things after 100 years, no one's going to know for sure. But it's a good picture of number 2, and it's a good picture of the Turner Center car. This is its mate, number 3, down to Wiscasset. This is probably still with the arc headlight on this one. This is probably taken, I'm guessing, around 1915 or so. This is down to Wiscasset. It's on the wharf. You can see the masts from the schooner there. In the background's a car of lumber. A lot of the lumber was shipped from down to Wiscasset and was shipped out by schooner. So freight going to Wiscasset didn't all go out on the Maine Central. A lot of it went out by sea, particularly the lumber. And that's undoubtedly what's going to be happening here. So that's a good picture with the ship and everything, I think. This is the number 4 locomotive right from the builder, the Leonard Atwood's extended cab. The steam dome, which is where the whistle was, where all the steam accumulated, is inside the cab. You can see the whistle protrudes through the roof. That had to have made that thing just unbearable in the summertime to try to run, although probably pretty nice in the winter. They're all completely enclosed. In the event of a derailment, there's no way out. You can't go out over the back. Theoretically, Atwood thought that would keep the fuel dry. Well, I guess he didn't care if his crew got killed, but he was going to keep his coal dry. That only ran like that a few years, and then they continued the metal cab, but they cut the part over the tender off, so at least they could get out the back if they needed to. Same locomotive. This is at Winslow. It's a Winslow station in the background. Of course, this locomotive was bought for that line. And this is when she was brand spanking new. This is when they first opened the line, and passenger cars departed Winslow, headed towards Weeks Mills. And she's shiny and new and looks pretty. Another picture, probably taken once again about the same time, 1902, 1903. Same locomotive. This one is actually taken at Weeks Mills. And you'll see in the little brochure I passed out about the stations that they actually had an engine house at that time at Weeks Mills down on the southern end of the train yard. This is supposedly the Weeks Mills engine house that shows in the background. Once again, nobody can tell you that for sure, but that's the supposition that we've got. Obviously, a small child there on the locomotive front. This is obviously a staged picture, but it was all part of apparently some publicity shots that they took at that time as they were promoting the railroad. This is also a picture on the Winslow branch. This is at North Vassalboro. Stations on that branch were constructed with a different design than on the regular railroad. Probably engine number 2 or number 3, hard to tell which. But it's with the passenger components that they used on that line. And another thing you can say for sure is that it would have been sometime between 1902, probably in 1910, in that range. Still has the old oil headlight on her, so pretty far back. This picture is interesting. It's at Winslow. This is after Peck bought the railroad. During a short period of time, they actually had passenger service at Winslow. The reason we know it's post-1907 is because that's engine number 7 there in the picture. And engine 7 probably did not run on that branch very much, but it's there in that picture at that time. So this is obviously very early on in the Peck years, right after the locomotive arrived. I've heard, which was the big locomotive, was actually too heavy for some of the bridges, and for a time period it was confined strictly to going to Albion. So number 7 is somewhat lighter. Obviously they had it running up to Winslow. Good picture. Who knows what that guy's thinking? He looks pretty dejected there or something. But there he is, and they're getting ready to leave. I'm a little out of order on my time frames here. This is that Mason's wreck I was telling you about that was in 1905. This was before Peck, but this was at the end of the Leonard Atwood Railroad. But these are all presumably Masons that were on their way to Wiscasset. This is at the Carlton Brook in down in Elna, head tide region, and trestle gave way, and they're in the water, and the locomotive you can see is right in the water. Luckily, nobody injured in this whole thing. But had that cab been fully extended, probably the crew would have drowned. But they cut it back by that time, and they were able to get out without injury. Picture looking at it from the other side, you can see that she's right down there in the water. But I'm sure it's more exciting than going to Wiscasset for a clam bake, you know. But this one is good. This shows the locomotive. The locomotive's in the water. In some of these pictures, you can see that the water was right up pretty high. You can't really see it in this one, but in a clearer picture, you can see the water was right up to those wheels that are showing. And the engineer and probably the engineer and the fireman are there in the cab, you know, or whatever. But luckily, they were able to get out. But that had to have been one hard landing when they landed down in the brook. You see they've propped that car up as a base there, holding that other car so it doesn't come crashing down on them. This was a few weeks later. They fished the locomotive out. They're pulling it back up onto the regular rails. In some of these pictures, you can see they're using oxen to actually move the locomotive. You can't see that here, but actually there's oxen up here that pulled it back up onto the rails. But that was a job getting that out. That was all in 1905. Back to looking at our stations and stuff. This is Weeks Mills. It's too bad this picture's cut off. The original picture, you could see all of the freight house, but this was taken before they moved the freight house. You're going to see a subsequent picture afterwards. So this was taken right at the very beginning of the Peck era. A couple of reasons you can tell that. The station's been painted with the wide green trim at the bottom, which occurred under Peck. And also they've got a lot of cream cans out there, so this is after they're hauling milk. But this is a pretty good shot of Weeks Mills on the very southern end of the rail yard, and we're looking towards the north would be to the right, and presumably Main Street goes right through there. Just beyond that would have been the water tower, and then it continues on up through past the cannery and sawmill and potato house, a bunch of stuff. Engine number 3. This is immediately after Peck's purchase. You can tell that as well because they stenciled the locomotives with the big script WWF Railway. Also, about that time, they rebuilt the cabs on these things, and a little different configuration there than what there was in some of the earlier pictures. They've still got the arc headlight. So this is probably somewhere between 1907 and possibly 1910. This is another good picture, and the last time we showed these, the WWF guys were there. We couldn't determine exactly where this was. I think we settled on North Whitefield. But it's a real good picture for a couple of reasons. I'm going to sharpen it up a little bit if I can. A couple of really good things here. Number one, they're delivering lumber to be shipped. They're bringing it in by oxen. It's kind of interesting. There's clearly what appears to possibly be a potato house off in the side. The locomotive is relatively new. That's the big number 6. It's still got its original headlight on it. And if you're really into this thing, the whistle it's got that you can see is the as-delivered whistle, which was later changed out. And then at the end, it went back to this one again. But this would put it early in its life. So this is, once again, probably no later than about 1910. But look at the women there, how well they're dressed standing on the platform. I mean, the whole thing is just a really nice picture. Another one, we couldn't determine where this was either, and we know it's not, well, we don't think it's head tide, so we can't say that. But once again, very nice. If you look at the women, how they're dressed, they're obviously waiting for a train to come in. There's a lot of luggage, baggage, whatever, express. It's going to be loaded onto that. It's all on the platform waiting for the train. There's some lumber there that's eventually at some point going to be loaded. There's lumber behind them. There's lumber off. Looks like on a wagon load that's behind the guy that's walking. Down the track a ways, that's obviously a section house for section maintenance. And like I said, the WWF guys looked at this and they couldn't figure out where it was. So we're not even going to venture a guess, but it's somewhere. And it's not Cooper's Mills, because in a minute you're going to have a Cooper's Mills picture and you'll see why it's not Cooper's Mills. So it could be, it's probably one of the Whitefields, but who knows. Here's Cooper's Mills. We know it's not that station because that one was constructed differently with this overhanging porch roof on just one side of it. Only station that looked like that. But this is Cooper's Mills in the 1920s. It looks like engine number 7 there with an electric headlight. So this is post 1920. Also, of course, the automobile kind of gives it away. But that is Cooper's Mills with a southbound facing train, I would say. And at least one of those, well, 2 of them, they both have smokestacks, stovepipes coming out, both the boxcars. So one is probably one of the cream cars. Second one, you can tell by the doors on it. So that's one of the cream cars. The one ahead of it is probably a potato car, because it looks like it has a smokestack as well, or a stovepipe as well. But good shot at number 7. This is down at Wiscasset. This is the wharf at Wiscasset. This was about 1920. That's the freight house that was out on the wharf. And it's kind of nice because you can see the boat in the background and stuff. Looks like it's probably low tide. But a lot of freight went out over that wharf. A lot of coal came in, a lot of lumber went out. Active place. This is at Wiscasset. This is the Diamond Crossing. And it's looking over at the Maine Central's railroad station. The WWF's railroad station would have been just to the right, and you can see this platform that came down. That's how where baggage and so on and so forth, and express was moved between stations down that platform on carts and then over to the WWF station. WWF train would have come to the left. It's going off towards the trestle and over to the yard. To the right, headed towards the shops and then the main line. But the train for WWF would have parked just off to the right there in front of the station for loading. This one is definitely head tide. I'm not making that up. It really is. Train time at head tide is what somebody's called this thing. Once again, this is not that ancient a picture because the locomotive appears to have an electric headlight. And you cannot see which one it is, but it appears to be either the 2 or the number 3. And obviously they've got a lot of milk sitting out there that's going to be loaded. And here's two sweet young ladies that are posing with number 7. It's got its electric headlight on it, so this is in the 1920s, and their dress also kind of, their attire would kind of suggest the 1920s, but kind of a good shot. Who knows who they are or where they are, but it's good of them. It's good of number 7. And an interesting thing is on the tender, on the water tank on number 7, they've got a drain valve, and all the locomotives, WWF put these drain valves on all of them. Not sure what the purpose was, but I guess in the event you need to drain the water, you could do it easily using that valve. I'm sure they weren't putting a glass under it and getting a drink out of it. But that's a pretty good shot at number 7. Gives an idea of the size of the piece of equipment. Number 7, again, this was when it was relatively new. It's at head tide. Believe it or not, it really is. The reason I can tell it's head tide is, well, number 1, I know it is, but the other reason is the head tide paint scheme was a little bit different. You can always spot it, but a lot of these pictures are taken at head tide. This has got the arc headlight on it. It's also got its original lettering from the factory on it. So this was taken shortly after the Peck era began, so probably, once again, 1907 to 1910. They're hauling some lumber there, looks like. Who knows what else is behind it, but they're headed towards Wiscasset. This was in the original slide set. This is actually the Sagadahoc steamer, which actually ran to Boston. And I don't believe it went into Wiscasset, although other steamers went to Wiscasset that would have met the railroad. This one ran from down in that region and stopped in Augusta, among other places, and then went on to Boston. That supposedly made 3 round trips a week. So the Sagadahoc made it to our train show, even though it probably didn't actually connect with the WWF. But it is similar to ones that it would have connected with, although probably a little bit larger. And this steamer ran, I believe, until 1905, I think, when the steamship company was bought out by somebody else, and this one was actually sold. But that's the Sagadahoc. This was the Macmillan send-off in the 1920s, big excursion that the railroad held. This was after Macmillan set sail from Wiscasset with a series of ships on an Arctic expedition, and they had a big time on the sailing. And the railroad ran a excursion, and they used every piece of passenger equipment they had, along with a bunch of box cars, 2 locomotives, one on the front, one on the rear, and they just had a high-o time going down to Wiscasset to see this thing. This was after the launch, and supposedly this was on the trip home when they're leaving Wiscasset. But every piece of passenger equipment the railroad owned was put into that train. And the last car there, the one closest to us, is the railway post office car that was on the final wreck. Head of it's their caboose, actually. This is a section crew up around Albion. These are all Albion guys, my understanding, and a typical hand car that they use. And the WWF Museum has a hand car very similar to that they actually had up to Albion a few weeks ago. Another section crew. This is probably a little bit earlier picture. Their hand cars in the background. This is probably early, well, probably the other one was early 1900s too. So probably the same time. This is at Whitefield on the Iron Bridge behind them. I can't tell if that's looking north or looking south. WWF guys couldn't tell either. But presumably if it is looking south, then the final derailment happened just our side of where these guys are standing years later. But at this time, they're there with their hand car and their dinner pails. Kind of interesting to see them between the track. You can see just how narrow the track is. Another section crew. This is in the Palermo gravel pit. And once again, this is probably in the late teens, early 20s. They're loading gravel. Looks like quite a job shoveling all that. They've been loading those cars by hand, but that's gravel for ballast. This is a picture. This is actually at head tide, surprise, surprise, with ice backing up from the river, and they're chiseling the ice out. I can't tell what locomotive it is, but there's a whole train behind it that's held up, and they're removing this ice that is encroached on the rails. This is the famous 1915 Manly Glidden wreck that occurred once again in Whitefield. This was engine number 6, which had a separate tender. You can't see the tender because it's literally bent around at 90-degree angle off the picture. But Manly, this was the last day of Manly Glidden's engineer career. There was an imperfection in the track, a sun kink, and Manly had plenty of time to slow down. Fireman warned him. He said, no, he says, we'll straighten it out. So instead of slowing down, he actually sped up, and it straightened him out all right. Manly wasn't injured. Actually, nobody was seriously hurt. Manly wasn't injured, but they said when Sam Sewell, the general manager, arrived on the scene that he almost killed him. So he survived the wreck, but not Sam Sewell's wrath. Because Sam relieved him of engineer duties that day. But Manly was actually so instrumental in cleaning up this wreck and some of the strategy they used that Sam made him the master mechanic of the railroad. and he was actually in charge of the wrecking trains after that. So Manley stayed with the railroad the rest of his career right up to the end. We got a picture of him in a second. But it's a good representation of the size of a narrow gauge locomotive as compared to the current standard gauge locomotives at that time. This is a picture taken probably about 1915, perhaps. That's Bridgeton and Saco River locomotive number 5, beside that Maine Central locomotive. Gives a good idea of the size, and that's in their transfer yards. Here's our Palermo station, a little bit better than that first one we saw. Bert Coombs, the station matcher out front, posing for that picture. This is one of the pictures taken by the Cunninghams, I believe, out of Liberty. And this comes from a glass negative. It's a pretty good shot. I can't tell the exact year, but would have been after the Peck administration. And I think that in the larger picture, you can see one of the Peck potato cars in the background. I think that boxcar is. So I would put this sometime in the 19-teens, probably. Weeks Mills, probably about the same time. This is after the freight house has been moved down closer to the station. It's engine number 6 that's in the picture, and it's engine number 6 after they've changed out the whistle. It's not the delivered whistle. Still has the arc headlight though, so it's prior to 1920. So probably in the late teens. Once again, you see all the cream out there, or milk. It's getting ready to be shipped. But it's a good picture of Wiscasset, of Weeks Mills. And actually, that train is northbound, so they would not be hauling milk north. So those could be empties that are sitting there that were dropped off previously that were going to be picked up by farmers the next morning when they delivered their new stuff. But that's part of the milk trade. Another one of Weeks Mills. This one's a little earlier. Actually, you can tell by the track configuration, but it's after they moved the freight house. And once again, milk cans lined up like crazy. So, and this is up to Albion. This is in 1930, approximately. Station today, coincidentally, looks almost identical to that, minus the train cars. But we restored up there. It looks just like that today, right to the platform. 1930, down at Wiscasset, number 7. As we said, number 7 ran out of tubes during 1931, went in the shop for retubing and went in the engine house, and of course was destroyed in a fire that year. This was last year of operation, so this was probably the summer of 1930. And that's the Wiscasset shop crew that's there posing in front of it. But good picture of the locomotive, shows its size. This is engine number 6 up at Lovejoy Pond in Albion. This is after a relatively minor derailment. Seems like number 6 was over on its side quite often. This time the tender didn't get banged around. She's still right there, and so on. But this was at Hammond Shore on Lovejoy Pond in Albion. And don't know what the cause of that was. I think they said it was a low rail or something, and she lost her balance. But nobody injured, and pretty minor affair. This Manley Glidden, this was taken in 1919 when he had just finished constructing this touring car that they used for track inspection and for the general manager's use. So this is in front of the shop at Wiscasset, and Manley is demonstrating the turning device on this thing. It's got a jack in the center that goes down, jacks the car up, they can turn it around to go the other direction. And he's showing that the caption to that picture said that Manley said it was so easy to turn that a woman could do it, you know. So there you go. That's what he said. But that's Manley after his engineer career was over. So 4 years after his debacle up there in North Whitefield with engine number 6. They later rebuilt that car. That's supposedly at Palermo, same car, but they've changed out the canvas top and they've got a different top on it. But it's supposed to be the same car. This was prior to them in 1932 lettering stenciling the locomotives, so this would put this probably in 1931. But as I had said, number 4, the last year or so of operation, this was after 7 and 6 went in for retubing. 4 was the biggest locomotive available, and that was used pretty extensively there for a couple of years. And it's Earl Keefe on the right, who was the engineer from Albion, and then Merle Glidden, who was the younger guy, is the fireman. And they're the ones who were in the final train wreck, albeit with a different locomotive. This up to Albion, this is towards the end of operations, probably around 1930 or so, but that's engine number 2. It's in the engine house coming out on the turntable. Big Peck potato house there that the Pecks built, still there. Oh, it's still there, this picture. That lasted until the 1970s when it caved in. Might have even been 1980. But just all that's left of it now is some abutments there, and it's out in the bushes right behind our station. Number 2 coming out of the roundhouse, probably that, or engine house, probably that same day as the other one. So this would have been towards the end of its life. Once again, it's before it was stenciled for WWF. So that would date this thing probably about 1930. Same day again, this was some sort of a special run they had going. They parked in front of the Albion station getting ready to depart. A lot of pictures taken that day of that train. Corn shop is in the background, way in the background, across the street. The boxcars on the siding probably are waiting there to go over to the corn shop. What about the cow catcher? Oh, that's the coupler. That's the front end automatic coupler. Yep. Number 2 again. This is the last year operation. This would have been probably 1932. Probably at that point 4 was laid up. They're using 2. You can see it's been stenciled. You can also see in the background. You can see number 6 after it's been burned. It's scorched back there. The engine house is gone, but it's still sitting there. And then a few days later, a year later, June 15th, this is number 8, 3rd day of operation. She's down over the bank. It did have a nice paint job. The 3rd day that they had it running. That's the flat car that came along that almost hit poor Merle after he jumped. It just missed him. So he was off to the side. Flat car went right past him. In some of these pictures, you can see up underneath, you can see the broken rail. You can't in this one. This is the same wreck 1 year later to the day, taken from across the river looking over. In the original picture, which we've got a much better one of it, that blow up on the table we got over there, you can see that some of the components off the locomotive have been stolen in that year. It's not sure if it's the headlight or the whistle, but something's missing if you look at the picture. They did actually have one of the milk cars on the wreck. Now, I don't believe they were still hauling milk at that time, but they did have, the milk car was there. So in the event they were hauling any milk, it went sour. But and the railway post office cars bringing up the rear. These cars all got towed back to head tide, and when they cleaned up the railroad a few years later, they sat on a siding there, and they sat there until the 1970s. You know. This is after operation ceased. This is down at the yard, and these are cars that never moved again. The coal that was there, this is that following winter. The coal that's there on these flat cars was actually for the locomotives, and obviously never was used. This is this gas after operations. You can see the equipment sitting there. It's deteriorating. That's a snowplow flanger behind it. And that's a shop building behind that. And that same boxcar we saw before, number 74, is off there to the side. Obviously, none of that stuff's moved any. Another picture about the same spot. One of the same cars we just saw. The snowplow and stuff is down beyond it. This was later on again when they're probably in the process of scrapping. So this has been a couple of years later. And here they are pulling up rails. And this is, once again, this up on the Sandy River, but same process was used, except they used horses, when they cleaned up the rails on the narrow gauge, in our narrow gauge. which probably was in a couple of years later, so I think it was about 1935 they pulled up the rails. And here's number 8. Several years later, she's still sitting there. The rails are gone, but the engine is sitting there, slowly deteriorating on the riverbank. And that sat there until World War II. Kind of sad looking at it. Still got a stencil on there. They got a chance to slap that on before she went over the bank. WWF Museum has that actual stencil. That's the stencil they use on their locomotives now. So then along comes Harry Percival, and Harry gave us these slides, because remember, we were in collaboration when we put this together. This is Harry in the summer of probably early summer of 1988. They were picking up the remains of flat car 218 down in Connecticut and getting ready to haul it home. And that was Harry's first thing he hauled home from Connecticut. This is the locomotive. I gotta focus that in. This was the locomotive, number 9. In this picture, it's carrying the number 6 because it was originally Sandy River's number 6. But this was it, and the barn it sat in for years and years and years down in Connecticut. And Harry acquired it a few years later, but he was going down and tinkering on it and keeping his claim alive on it at this time. But this was taken in '88. Here's some other pictures. They hauled it out. Must have pulled it out with the pickup truck. Picture of the inside of the cab. Picture of the steam gauge. That's not a Crosby steam gauge. George Crosby would have been upset. Picture of the boiler. That boiler has been changed out now, but they have it in operation. It looks just the same, but the brake lever there, the brake wheel for the tender brakes, still looks just the same. The inside of that thing, of course, now is all re-piped up, and she looks really sharp. I wish I had a nice slide to that to show what it looks like today, because she looks a lot better than that. That thing runs every weekend. Another picture of it. Another picture of it. She looks a lot better today. When we do our train shows down at Windsor Fair, we've got a picture, we don't do the slides, we got a picture of number 9 taken this summer that we show in comparison to some of the other locomotives. And people are quite impressed when they see it. And that's the end of this thing. So we can have the lights.